Welcome back to our survey of the New Testament. This is our last video in the series, which means we'll be covering the book of Revelation. If you want to open your Bible there, and as you're turning there, I want to make a quick note. Revelation is the only book of prophecy in the New Testament, and as it goes with other books of prophecy in the Bible, to really get a good understanding of the book, you need to have an in-depth study of it. That way all the intricacies and the challenging parts of it can be dealt with at length and given the detail they require. Now, I say that at the beginning of this video because we need to remind ourselves that this is just a survey. And really, the purpose of our survey of Revelation, or just our introduction to it, I think it's a better term, is just to give us a taste and give us a feel for the overall message. So keep that in mind as I go through some of this stuff, because we're not going to be diving into too much detail. We're not going to be getting into too much of the debate about what this means and what that means. We're just simply going to look at who wrote it, what are the possible dates for the book, what's the overall message, and some keys to understanding the book of Revelation. And with that in mind, I hope you're there, because we're going to be starting with the writer of Revelation. Looking in chapter 1, in verse 1, we read this of the book of Revelation. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his bondservants, the things which must soon take place. And he sent and communicated it by his angel to his bondservant John. Now the writer is further identified in verse 9 of the same chapter, where the writer says, I, John, your brother, and fellow partaker in the tribulation and kingdom and perseverance which are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos, because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. So while the writer does not identify himself as John the Apostle, the earliest testimony from the early church writers unanimously say that it was John the Apostle who wrote this letter. Justin Martyr, who lived at the turn of the 2nd century, so AD 100, and he lived to AD 165, he attributed the book to John the Apostle. Irenaeus, who lived from 130 to 202 AD, he also attributed this book to John. And he was born and educated in the Roman province of Asia, where the 7 churches of Asia in this book are addressed and where they were located. And again, he also believed that John was the writer. Now let's tackle the date real quick. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, our purpose in this video is not to nail down a specific date. What I want to do is just present the 2 most probable dates, or the 2 dates that have the best cases for them. And I'm going to talk about their strengths and one weakness of each of them. So there's 2 possible dates, as I said. There's an early date and a late date. The early date is around AD 68 to AD 70. The late date is around AD 90 to 96. Now, before we look at the strengths and weaknesses, I like this quote from Brian Haynes in his book, Understanding the Revelation of John. He said, whatever the date, the theme of Revelation, of persecution, kingdom authority, and the endurance of the saints is unchanged. The value of the letter for our edification is unchanged, whatever date is accurate. And he's right. When we understand the keys when we get the keys to understanding Revelation, which we'll cover in just a moment, we'll automatically rule out various false ideas and false interpretations of Revelation. And we're only left with a symbolic or a metaphorical interpretation. Again, like I said, we'll touch on that in just a moment. But that means that so long as we have that interpretation context in mind, it doesn't matter really what the dates are, because the theme, message, and purpose for our edification and encouragement remains the same. And keep that in mind as we go through these. So the early date, AD 68 through AD 70. Clement of Alexandria, who lived around AD 150, took this position. And he writes in Book 7, Chapter 17 of his Stramata, his miscellaneous writings, mainly against the Gnostic false teachers. He said this about the apostles' writings. He said, and that of the apostles embracing the ministry of Paul ends with Nero. So Clement of Alexandria was the opinion that all the apostles' works, their writings, all of it was completed by the reign, or at least by the death of Nero, which was in AD 70. So he took that position, and again, he lives in the 1st century. There is broad historical evidence that would corroborate that position. such as the fact that Nero is on record of having intense persecution against the Christians, which would fit the theme of the persecution of the church within the book of Revelation. And again, Nero was a known, he was known not to like Christians, so he fits the bill. The problem is this view lacks any broad support among the early church writers. It seems that Clement of Alexandria is kind of alone in this position. But moving on to the later date, so this would place the reign during the this would place the book during the reign of Domitian, and that's around 80. He reigned from 81 to 96. This was the belief of the some of the earlier church writers, such as Irenaeus, Origen, and Jerome. And again, this was the most prevalent view among the early church writers. The only problem is that there's really no broad historical evidence to corroborate that it was Domitian who had the intense persecution against the Christians that fit the theme of this book. The only reference we have is Eusebius, and Eusebius has his own problems as far as historical accuracy. I don't doubt his character in writing it, but there's some historical issues with his writings. So, as we see, both dates have some support among the early church writers, and both of them have their weaknesses. But again, the date really doesn't matter in terms of it doesn't change the theme and message of the book. Brian Haynes went on to say in that same book, Understand the Revelation of John, he said the value of figuring out the date, quote, allows us to ascribe certain particulars to the book, to characters and events in history. Basically, it just allows us to figure out, okay, when is this happening? Who's who in the book? It doesn't change the theme. Now, let's get to the original recipients of this book. Now, we know that this book was also meant to be for later generations to read, because we see in chapter 1, verse 3, the blessing of whoever reads this book. It says, "Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of the prophecy and heed the things which are written in it, for the time is near." That blessing applies to all, even expanding out from the original recipients. But the original recipients were the 7 churches of Asia. And we look in chapter 1, verse 4. The writer says, "John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before his throne." And we see also in verse 11, Jesus says here, "Write in a book what you see, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, and to Smyrna, and to Pergamum, and to Thyatira, and to Sardis, and to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea." That 7 there, and this is very true with other prophetic books, is that 7 here represents a fullness, a completeness. So while it's addressed to these 7 specific churches, we might also say that this represents a completed message to the whole church at large, a fullness, if you will, since that 7 represents completion in the Jewish understanding of things and in the Bible itself most of the time. So again, we can also see this as a message to all the churches, but contextually, the original audience was these 7 churches of Asia. And now moving on to the keys to understand the book of Revelation. We need to understand the type of literature that Revelation falls underneath. It falls underneath something called apocalyptic literature. And that comes from the Greek word to mean unveil or to uncover. And the other books of the Bible that fall underneath this category are Daniel and Ezekiel. So the 3 are Daniel, Ezekiel, and Revelation. They all fall underneath this category of apocalyptic literature, which means they're unveiling the message through signs and symbols. We want to look in Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his bondservants, the things which must soon take place. And he sent and communicated by his angel to his bondservant John." That word communicated in the New American Standard has a little footnote, says signified. That's what the older translations like King James and New King James have as well. But as the word there literally means to show in symbols, to signify with pictures. So John is telling us outright at the front that this message is going to have a lot of imagery, a lot of symbols and signs, which would tell us, to any reader with common sense, which I believe all of us do have, that a strictly literal interpretation of the book of Revelation is not warranted, because John's telling us from the very beginning that it's communicated in signs and symbols. which explains why the book of Revelation is full of amazing details and strange symbolism and fantastic imagery. It's because God is communicating spiritual truths through these word pictures, if you will. And that's really the key to understand this book, is understand that it's symbolic. It is. And so that would rule out a literal interpretation of the book. And so that brings us, as we close, to our theme. We're not digging too much in the book of Revelation because, like I said, this deserves a fuller treatment in a study of the book. But if you want to look in chapter 17 and verse 14, this verse, I believe, sums up the book of Revelation very well. In chapter 17 and the verses 14, these will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are the called and chosen and faithful. No matter how bad things get for the people of God, in the end, God is triumphant. No matter how desperate it seems for the church, Christ will win in the end, because, as the text says, he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and no one can usurp his domain. And that's really the theme of the whole book. And that's why the letter is supposed to be encouraging to the original recipients and for all Christians of all times. That no matter how bad things get, no matter if it seems like Satan is getting ready to destroy the entire church, God has assured us that he wins in the end. And that's really the whole message of Revelation. I hope this has piqued your interest. Maybe it's encouraged you to study deeper into the scriptures. We encourage you to do so. We can help you with that. If you want to contact us through our website at churchofchristtucson.org, we have a Contact Us tab. You can just click at the top of the page and you can request a study or send us a message. We would love if you would do so. And if you're in the greater Tucson area, we encourage you to come worship with us. We meet at 145 North Country Club Road, and the nearest cross street is Country Club and Broadway. We meet at 10 a.m. right now on Sunday morning for worship. And we live stream our midweek Bible study Wednesday night starting at 7 p.m. and an evening lesson as well around 6 p.m. on Sunday evenings. As always, have a great week and God bless.